Okay, welcome to the second of 3 critical conversations that we are hosting this week as part of SLF Online. Just a reminder to those who are joining, if you can keep your cameras and your mics off, that would be much appreciated. And also, please feel free to use the chat to share your thoughts, your questions, your observations, your challenges, your agreements, whatever you feel moved to do, please use the chat to do so. Last night, the chat was full of comments and observations and reflections, and it was really helpful to see. You can also use the like and love functions, so you can engage with other comments from other audience members as well. So please feel free to get involved and engage through the chat. Yesterday we were exploring curriculum, tomorrow we're exploring leadership, and so tonight in the middle we have empowerment, which does make me wonder if perhaps empowerment is something like the connective tissue. I was going to use a sandwich analogy, maybe the jam in the sandwich, but maybe it's more like the connective tissue that helps us with both of those endeavours. But I'm sure that's something that we will come on and explore collectively in a wee while. My name's Sarah. I'm delighted to have been asked to host these critical conversations. As a psychologist and as a coach and as an educator, I've worked across the system, both nationally and locally, but I'm not connected to any organisation. So I'm delighted to be here facilitating this conversation tonight. Last night was a really great conversation. It was a really honest conversation. There was lots of challenge. We explored the tensions. We explored the strengths of what we have, and it was really engaging. And I have no doubt that tonight will be more of the same, particularly around this topic of empowerment and agency. So my first job is to introduce my colleagues who are here with me tonight. And just as I did last night, I have these written down in front of me because there's no way I can remember all of that. So in no particular order, we have Larry Flanagan, who after spending 33 years in the classroom became the General Secretary of the EIS in 2012. He has had a career-long association with the EIS as an activist, a school representative, local office bearer, council and executive committee member and convener of the EIS Education Committee. So welcome, Larry. We also have Gail Gorman, who was appointed as Chief Executive and Chief Inspector of Education in December 2017, a role that brings with it, I'm sure, many responsibilities, remits across both the educational landscape and beyond as well. And in a conversation with Norman Drummond last year, Gail shared the importance of wonder in education and learning and how this inspired her as a child, but also how it continues to inspire her now. We also have Carrie Lindsay, who left school and trained as an early years officer before becoming a teacher, during which time the importance of effective pedagogy and valuing the views of children and young people became a real driver for her. As the Executive Director of Education and Children's Services in Fife, Carrie continues to look for better connections across children's services to support children, young people and their families. And as if that doesn't keep her busy enough, she has 2 other roles as Regional Improvement Collaborative Lead for the South East Improvement Collaborative. Goodness, that's a mouthful. And she is also President within the Association of Directors of Education Scotland. And she started her day online with SLF and she's closing her day online with us as well. So thank you, Carrie, for joining us. We also have Graham Logan. Graham is Director of Learning at the Scottish Government, and that's a wide-ranging role which involves leading on all aspects of policy and strategy for school education at national level in Scotland. He's worked in a number of senior roles in Education Scotland and Scottish Government, and a key driver for Graham is to do all that he can do to improve the life chances, experiences and outcomes for children living in poverty in Scotland. Mark Priestley joins us. Mark is Professor of Education at Stirling University, probably very well known for his work on curriculum, both theory, policy and practice, and of course teacher agency. And in January this year, his book, Curriculum Making in Europe, which Carrie has already showed us, she has a copy sitting there next to her as well. She can be my assistant, there we go, was published early this year. And as we can see from behind Mark, when he's not sharing his wisdom on these topics, he can usually be found up a mountain somewhere. We also have Stephen Kelly, who is head teacher at Liberton High School and has been for about 10 years now. And he was recently one of 12 poverty commissioners whose work led to the publication of a Just Capital Actions to End Poverty in Edinburgh. And he's recently been appointed as an associate head teacher in Edinburgh Council with a focus on equalities. Also, if you follow Stephen on Twitter, which I do, you will know that he has not only a passion, but also, from what I can tell, a skill for cooking. So definitely give him a follow, you'll be quite impressed. And last but by no means least, we have Gemma Clarke. Gemma is a primary 5 teacher in Inverclyde with an interest in innovative wellbeing initiatives. She is also a massage in schools instructor, children's yoga teacher, and mindfulness instructor. She's a founder of the Teacher Wellbeing Group, which is Scottish Teachers for Positive Change and Wellbeing. And she also writes for the Times Ed in her spare time, as well as being a trustee for the St. Petersburg Forum, which is a charity that fosters educational and cultural links between Russia and Scotland. So delighted to have everybody here tonight for this particular conversation. And I guess where I want to start is around some of the language that we hear and that we use around empowerment and agency. And I think it's a topic, it's a theme, whatever we want to call it, that has a lot of words connected with it. And perhaps in some cases that maybe leads to confusion or a lack of shared clarity. And perhaps that connects with something that, Gail, you shared in your keynote address yesterday around an emerging focus for Education Scotland around language and developing shared language and understanding around what we mean. So it felt like the right place to start to kind of build some clarity and to explore some of the language around empowerment. So we often hear words like empowerment, agency, autonomy, independence. Mark, can you help us out? Can you give us some understanding of what those words are? What do they mean?
Okay, I'll have a go then. Well, hello everyone, and it's a great pleasure, I have to say, to be here tonight in this company talking about this issue, which has been close to my heart for quite a few years now. I think let's start with the words, and then I'll move on to the concepts, because we have a tendency, I think, to pick words and to use them often quite uncritically, and they can have the feel of slogans at times. And empowerment is just such a word. It can often feel like a slogan. So I think we really need to get into what we mean by these terms. Empowerment is actually quite a contested concept. It can mean, on the one hand, quite a benign approach to handing over power to individuals. It can be based in issues of social justice and emancipation in communities, and is associated, for example, with the work of Paulo Freire in education about emancipatory curriculum development. But often it's associated with what might be called more neoliberal conceptions. So it's about individual responsibility. It's about handing over power from the centre to the periphery with the responsibility that goes with that. And often is then associated with having someone to blame if things go wrong. And I think we absolutely need to be very clear about what we mean by empowerment if we're using it to support agendas in education. Now, personally, I prefer the word agency, and agency is often conflated with autonomy as well. So I just want to say a couple of things about that. Autonomy is often understood as freedom from regulation, and that can go hand in hand with empowerment if we're simply handing over power to people to get things done. But autonomy, understood as freedom from regulation, often I would say reduces power or reduces agency, because agency is, I think, clearly seen, and I think it's a good concept for education, as the capacity to make critical choices, the capacity to act, the capacity to choose between different repertoires for action. And if we hand over complete responsibility, or if we take away regulation, often what we're doing is taking away the resources that people need. So agency for me is partly about the individual. It's partly about the individual capacity to do things, but it's also about the conditions which make doing things possible. And as an experienced teacher, I could be absolutely achieving agency in one setting because I have the right resources and tools to do it. But in another setting, I can be completely disabled by my context. So when we're talking about things like empowerment and agency and autonomy, I think we really need to think carefully about two things. We need to think about how we enable people to be, I suppose, more powerful individuals through the skills, knowledge, attributes they have. But we also need to think about the conditions which enable that power to be used. And just one final point before I hand over. We need to think about the different types of power. Power is often conceptualized as power over, but I think we can also see power as power with. And if we're creating strong networks to enable people to be agentic teachers, that is about enabling us to work together to make the best of the collaborations that we have. So I'll pause on that note and hand over to someone else.
And I guess it would be interesting to hear different perspectives on what you've just shared with us there, but also what are our experiences of that? Do we feel that? Do we live that? Do we nurture that? So would anybody like to jump in and share their reflections on their experiences of what Mark has just described there for us? Gail, you look like you were about to.
I'm happy to. Good evening, everyone, and again, like Mark, delighted to be here. I suppose it really resonates, as most of Mark's work has done with me over the years, about the interconnectedness that Mark just described between the vocabulary we use around this, and it does link back, Sarah, as you said, to what I said yesterday morning at SLF. So for me, I think that empowerment has been used. It's the policy label that's been used here. But Mark's quite right in terms of many conversations I've had with school leaders and with teachers. I've in a keynote often said, empowerment could imply it's something that has to be given to you. It's a passive activity rather than, an engaged activity. And agency is really good in terms of, as Mark summed up there, the act, the empowerment of the person, of the individual. But one of the things I think is quite interesting is, in my reflections around it, is I think we do have to clarify the language. We have to settle on one and then define what that is for Scotland, and unpick the baggage. But that's a good conversation to have. So what are the nuances? What are the differences? This is what we should be talking about. I know for obvious reasons we've all been absorbed with health and well-being and with mitigations and measuring tapes and all of those things. But actually, let's get excited about thinking about this and the possibilities. Because Mark's reflections there around the context, I think if we take context to me, the bigger area, we have a context with COVID where I'd be really interested to see what people put in the chat around, how their experiences of this were, where when I talk to colleagues all around the country, many practitioners feel that during COVID they felt the most empowered they had ever felt, because they were physically in their own homes. They were, physically kind of in a virtual box with their kids, with the young people, and they were, really being innovative and creative and thinking on the spot and designing and doing the curriculum making that Mark often talks about, the curriculum design. And yet I also hear conversely others who feel, because of the situation we were in, who feel that the absolute opposite, that empowerment, kind of regressed for them, and they felt that they were following central diktats and all of the above. So I'm interested in the tensions and then the opportunities and learning that we can take from that to move it forward.
Thank you, and I'd just encourage those who have joined us just to share their reflections in the chat there as well. What was your personal experience? What was your personal lived experience during the last 18 months of empowerment? Did you feel empowered and did you feel disempowered? And like you, Gail, I've heard both sides of that as well, which is interesting to unpick. Larry, I think you waved at me there. Would you like to come in?
Thanks, Sarah. I do think the discussion around language is critical, and maybe as an English teacher, you'd expect me to say that. But so if I look out of my window just now, I would say to you, it's Guy Drake, because that's the weather's turn, and most of you will understand what I mean by that because you've experienced it, so you know what that means in reality. And Mark kind of touched on this because I think for practitioners, the litmus test for what words mean is what does it actually feel like in practice to me. You know, we've had nearly 2 years talking about the Empower Schools agenda, and for a lot of practitioners, it's still a dialogue that's taking place, up here, because it hasn't translated into a practice that they recognise. So, I mean, I'm really keen that as we develop a discussion around empowerment, that it has to have a practical manifest for people. So, and somebody's put in the chat, environment and ethos for school can either not hinder teacher agency. So there are lots of people who already feel empowered, who are already enabled because of the way that their school operates, the collegiate practice in their school. And part of the discussion we're having is that that's not universal across the system. So we're not inventing something new here. We're trying to look at where is a good practice and how do we translate it into a more common practice. And I think it's quite interesting that this discussion, and I totally agree with Gail, I don't think you can empower people. I just think that, that to me, there's a contradiction in terms there. The Scottish Government says it's going to empower teachers. They haven't asked teachers, do you want to be empowered? What does it mean? But I think this all started with the Head Teachers Charter, which was a very, very limited concept of empowering school. And it's developed into a much stronger narrative around empowering schools. And I do think, I'll make this one last point just now, Sarah. I mean, I do think there is a huge level of interest amongst practitioners around agency, professional autonomy, and having control over the practice. I think there's a challenge around, time, as ever. So I think this is a rich theme for us to be looking at as a system. But I do think ultimately the litmus test will be, what does that actually mean in practice? How do things feel different for me in my school? How am I able to serve my students better as a result of this? So I think we have to think about practical applications of the language that we're using and not have a theoretical discussion around concepts.
Yes, it's how do we walk the talk, I guess. And perfect opportunity for me to bring in Gemma and Stephen there. Stephen, you were waving at me, so I'll go to you first if that's okay, and then Gemma, that would be helpful to hear from you, that lived experience of it. Oh, you're on mute, Stephen. It's okay, it happens every time.
It's like speaking to my mother on a Zoom call. I suppose the first thing to say, I thought I knew about stuff until Mark Priestley started speaking, and I realised I don't know that much at all. I'm interested in this notion of doing it in practice, because before you start practicing, I think we need to be very clear about what we need, what it means, because I think everybody in this culture are walking about with anchored notions of hierarchical management structures, and we experience the notion of power dynamics in schools all the time. And you can introduce words like empowerment and agency, but to what extent has that sort of permeated the culture and practice? Because if I go for a head teacher's job, the first question I'm likely to be asked is, what's your vision for the school? And if I turn around and say, well, I'm going to go to the school, I'm going to get to know my colleagues, I'm going to try to understand the context, we're going to develop a shared purpose, and then we're going to co-construct a vision, that's not what the answer, I don't think that's the answer people are expecting. So I think all that notion of the current culture and power dynamics need to be unpicked. So we're very, very clear about what we mean with empowerment and agency in the context of running schools.
Thank you. Gemma, what's your experiences been?
Well, I think education, especially just now, it's very highly politicised, and there's a lot going on that you feel that you don't have any kind of control over. My experience is that I think if you use your autonomy as a citizen and try and become involved in that political process, you feel that you have some more autonomy. A lot of decisions that are made, it's made with the kind of the media coverage that will come from it in mind, rather than in consultation with teachers or the difference that it will make in the classroom. So I think that for me, empowerment means accepting that the profession is highly politicised and making connections with people, organising, finding people with a kind of shared vision and working out how we navigate this politicised system to try and bring the change that people are looking for.
And we have an observation in the chat around the role of trust in this, and is it dynamic? I guess Carrie and Graham, can I bring you in at this point? Anything you'd like to add or comment on?
Yeah, I just put in the chat there about that it takes a long time for that collective meaning of anything, you know, what is our understanding? And I think that we see that in society, that language, and I'm not an English teacher, so but that language is really important in how we use it, but it does change over time, and that collective meaning for me is really important. So, but I do believe firmly in the trust aspect, and I think that giving permission is about that trust, and it's about ensuring that people have ownership within a framework, whatever that looks like, but that if you give the trust and you give the permission, then people take that ownership on and deliver. And I think that that's sometimes we're scared to give the permission, and I think that holds people back because we're scared what the outcomes will be. And maybe we need to think a bit more about how we focus on the outcomes jointly rather than the inputs, so that we then can think about what it is we're trying to jointly do with the agency.
Yeah. Graham.
Thanks, Sarah. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to join the discussion. I mean, I think in terms of the language, what I would say is that we don't want the language to be a barrier to this, and we don't want to get tied up around different terms. At a very basic level, we want to know that teachers and head teachers are empowered to take the decisions for the children and young people in their care, and the best decisions to meet their needs. I think if you frame this in terms of meeting learners' needs, teachers and head teachers do feel more empowered than perhaps if you think of, you know, sort of curriculum strategy and so on. So I think context is important. I think, as Carrie says, and as Mark alluded to as well, the framework around it is really important. There are parameters and frameworks that we're operating within. So a phrase we often use in terms of curriculum for excellence is freedom within a framework. So I think it's important that teachers have the support, the supporting frameworks, the supporting guidance and advice to make the best critical decisions for the young people in their care. And I think Mark's right to emphasise it's that criticality and making those critical choices that are really important. If we look at developments like pupil equity funding, where schools have really interrogated their issues really carefully, really deeply, with a sense of criticality, they've tended to make choices to use the money in ways that have impacted strongly on pupils. So finally, for me, a really good practical example of empowerment in action is when we see groups of teachers using professional inquiry to really get into the depths of issues, really explore issues critically, and use that inquiry-based improvement to make those decisions that meet the needs of the young people in their care.
Yeah. And I guess we could continue talking about the language and the words and the meaning and what that looks like in practice for quite some time, and we would probably never get to anything else. So I'm going to move us on a little bit and actually pick up on some of the things that have started to come through in the chat. And Mark, you alluded to these as well. You talked about the kind of enabling conditions. What is it we actually need in order for this to work, for us to kind of nurture this? Trust is coming up. And you've commented on in the chat as well. Can I just ask you to say a little bit more about the role of trust here?
Well, can I talk a little bit more broadly first and then come back to trust? I mean, agency is about what is possible, but it's also about what people think is possible. Because if we work in a risky environment where there is low trust, people will not take risky decisions. So if the decision is about a particular curriculum innovation and perceived consequences exist, whether they're real or not, then people will always fall short of taking that decision. So trust is an important part of that. But I think I really want to stress strongly that the agency is partly about the capacity of people. It's about their critical knowledge, it's about their skills, it's about their attributes, it's about their disposition towards their practice and so on. But it is also especially about the environments they're working in and trust is a part of that. Trust is something that happens in some environments and not in others. And if we have schools or other social environments in educational settings which are very hierarchical, for example, with imbalances of power, then trust tends to be in more limited supply. So I think it's important that we think about the ways in which schools are structured in terms of the relationships, the roles between people, but also in terms of the sort of cultural expectations, what's deemed to be acceptable and not. And resources are really important as part of this. And by resources, I'm talking obviously about material resources, but I'm also talking about what might be called relational resources. If we're embedded in meaningful networks that are inspired by vision, then we're going to work together often more constructively and support each other. So that enables agency. Likewise, cognitive resources, the importance, and Graham mentioned professional inquiry here. As part of professional inquiry, we encourage teachers to engage with research findings, with ideas about education, and they provide the cognitive or the cultural resources that are needed to achieve agency as well. So it's about much more than the individual. It's about creating those conditions, and trust is only a very small part of that, I think.
Okay, that's very helpful. Gemma and Stephen, can I come to you again? Just interested in your thoughts and reflections on those conditions, maybe how you've experienced them or how you would like to experience them.
I think trust is essential at all levels. You know, I think to be trusted within your school is essential, but I think also to be trusted as a professional in general really matters. So it's been announced that HMIE are coming back into schools now in the middle of a pandemic. And if you look at countries like Finland that have the highest PISA rankings consistently year after year, there's that professional trust. They don't do inspections. They have schools working collaboratively. So I think that's an example where teachers should be more trusted, and I think would feel more empowered if there was collaboration rather than scrutiny, inspection, you know, and the stress of things like that coming up, especially with COVID going on. But I think if we were more like Finland and more trusted, I think that would be much more empowering for people. You don't get the best out of people when they're, you know, when they feel that they have this lack of trust. As Mark said, there's less risk taking, there's more fear about doing things, so you don't get the empowerment.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Gemma. Stephen, do you want to come in? You're muted again. And then Gail, get you.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if I want to get into a big debate about removing school inspections, but there's certainly an opportunity post-pandemic, and reading the Stobart report, to perhaps look at things completely differently in terms of our culture, in terms of how we organise schools. In terms of what needs to be in place, I think it's got to be a culture. There's got to be a culture in schools where we invite criticality, and people who are critical are not seen as the problem, that they're actually embraced, and actually they are themselves agents for change. So we need to flatten hierarchies. We need to share the problems. We need to share the challenges with our staff. We need to share the data. And then again, it's all about that co-construction of how we're going to get to those shared aims within that framework that Graham was talking about, and actually trusting people to know that they have solutions that you haven't thought of or not aware of, because their experiences might be better, different, diverse voices on the table, because the problems we're trying to solve are complex and we need a diverse range of voices on the table. So a culture that's invitational in nature, that invites criticality, I think are essential.
Thank you, Stephen. Gail. Yeah,
I totally understand, particularly this week, some of the coverage there's been around HMI activity and others, and as Stephen rightly said there, we don't want to swing the conversation towards that, but you would expect me, if nothing else, to comment on it. So actually, we're not restarting inspection, regardless of what the Daily Mail headline is. Actually, what we're doing is continuing a series of visits that actually, it's a visit, it's not an inspection, it's a visit. It's to talk to schools and colleagues and understand the improvement work that's going on, to recognise and celebrate and share success. Now, I know no matter what way I organise those words, there is an issue about, as Mark referenced earlier, if that's a perception around, often, it's Mark's point, Stephen's point earlier, often, I hear things and I myth bust them when I hear them. Oh, we've got to do this for HMIE, we've got to do this because they wouldn't like it. And actually not one of those single things matters to myself or to my team. What matters is the learning and what's happening for individual young people, same as every teacher in the country. That's what we focus on. So I think there's work we need to do. We were going to come out and talk to teachers and others, use teacher agency to think about what is the next step in that evolution. We've got the reform work now going on, that'd be part of that. And actually, as educators ourselves, the whole of it, we're all educators, actually really keen to do that, because in an empowered system, if we use that word at the moment as how it's been used, actually all parts of the system need to support empowerment, including inspection. So I think there's lots of opportunities here, but I really think that the kind of comments that you made there about having a learning system where you invite that criticality, but also the positivity that comes with it, the recognition that actually most school inspections in Scotland are very positive and actually celebrate the achievements of a school. So how do we collectively as a system work on that? But if we can get the agency and the conversation right and the ownership of it, it then becomes shared system improvement. And that's probably, where we need to head to.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Gail. Carrie, do you want to come in there? You were...
Yeah, I think we've got a real opportunity in Scottish education to be brave at this point in time. Gail mentioned the reform work there, and I think that we need to have that debate about is scrutiny the way to improve things, or is collaboration the way to improve things, and what is it we believe as a country that we want to support our profession to be able to do. And there's a lot of chat in there about Finland and the trust that people see there. I've done a study trip to Norway and similarly seen the trust that's given to the staff there. So there are models that we can learn from that are not always based on just what we've always done. And I think that that's probably where we need to start to go. Let's look at the things that do work really well, and let's think what we can then build into our system here in Scotland.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Larry and then Graham.
Yeah, I appeared today in front of the Parliament's Education Committee on the alternative certification model, and it was interesting. I get queried on a phrase in our submission, where we'd argued for less quality assurance from the SQA and more trust in teachers, and I'd said clearly the EIS had more trust in teachers than Scottish Government or SQA, and that was immediately jumped upon, and I was asked, are you saying Scottish Government have no trust in teachers? And this is one of the things around language, because it often gets hijacked into a different debate altogether. And it's interesting seeing the comments in the chat here around the study visits to Finland, because I was in Finland with the Deputy First Minister a few years back for an international summit, and we visited a school, and on the way out, I actually said to the DFM, did you notice how often the word trust was used when people were talking to us? Mm-hmm. And we actually, at the end of the summit, we agreed a course of action between Scottish Government and the teacher unions, that we would try to build trust into the Scottish education system. In fact, it was a kind of forerunner of this debate around school empowerment. So I think we should build on goodwill where it is there, but perceptions are important. So I'll spare Gail a debate around school inspection, right? But I can tell you from my inbox this week that there is a strong perception in schools amongst practitioners that HMI are coming calling, right? And people are saying, in the middle of a pandemic, this is the wrong message. Now, Gail and I have actually discussed what's happening, but this is almost back to the thing around language.
Yeah.
The language, actions and language have to be interlinked in a way that makes sense. So I think we still have, I agree with Stephen's points around hierarchical systems, but one of the other difficulties we have is that the politicised nature of a debate around Scottish education makes it really difficult, because everything that educationalists want to talk about then gets interpreted into, the party politics. And I'm not commenting on the party politics other than to say, for me, it's noises off, right? And I think as a system, we need to concentrate on what makes a difference for students. And I certainly think greater teacher agency will make a critical difference for young people, because it is all predicated on classroom practice and meeting the needs of the pupils in front of you. By and large, teachers get engaged because of the pupils in front of them, the kids that they're working with. And that's why they want to improve their approach so they get better outcomes. No, not for the stats, not for Graham to report to a committee, but just for the 30 kids in the room that they're working with on a day-to-day basis.
Since you mentioned Graham, we'll let him come in there.
Thanks for that, Sarah. I'll not take the bait from Mr. Flanagan on that one there. But yeah, just to say, I mean, I think as Carrie said, I think we have got a real opportunity here with the reform agenda, and a great chance to take empowerment forward. Professor Ken Muir will shortly be launching a consultation about the way forward. Oh, I thought I had a heckler there. And there's some really important big questions in that consultation about the future of Scottish education, and really importantly, how do we organise all of those around schools to give the best possible support to teachers and head teachers and others to make the best decisions they can for the children in their care. So let's not get obsessed on structural stuff and so on. Let's really focus on this, what could be, a once in a generational opportunity to really look at the system critically and constructively and confidently as a profession, think about how best to organise it to make the greatest difference. So a slight plug there for Ken Muir's consultation, which is coming out shortly, but a real opportunity, I think, to show that we do have an empowered profession in Scotland with ideas, with challenge, on how to make our system even better.
Yeah, and I think
I think that was actually Ken squealing there, Graham, at the start.
I think there's general agreement that there is real potential and there is a real possibility here. It's how we then take that and realise that in practice and in our lived experiences and our realities. One of the things that keeps kind of coming up in different conversations and ideas around there have been around connectedness, co-construction, just connectedness and connection in general. And I'm just wondering, and I might come to you, Carrie, if that's okay, because I know that's a particular kind of interest for you, but how do we embrace the possibility that connection gives us, and how does it help us with empowerment and agency?
Yeah, I think there's a history in our society of being in silos, isn't there, where schools are seen to be at the heart of the community, but only at the heart of community for children when they're in school. There are some schools that truly are at the heart of the community, but that's rare. And I think that we are moving towards a society where we need to think about the local places that we live, about the services that we wrap around children and young people and their families, and about how they connect together. We'll never, even with teacher agency, which I genuinely absolutely sign up to, even with the best teacher agency, there are a lot of things that are still going to mean that some of our children don't get the best chances. And we need to think about how we work together on child poverty, about closing the gap, about the barriers to learning, not just for those that live in areas of deprivation, but the barriers to learning for a whole range of other reasons, and the protected characteristics that those young people will have. So I do believe in that connection, not just within education, but it's really important there, but beyond the walls of the school, so that we are doing the best we possibly can. And no school is going to, change everything on its own. And we know that education can do a lot. It can absolutely do a lot, and I genuinely believe that. But if we don't work together as a children's services, then we've got real difficulty. And I think that the National Care Service consultation that's out just now, that hopefully there was a plug there that Graham made for Kent's consultation. I'd make a plug for the people to look at the National Care Service consultation too, and the scope that's in there about whether or not children's services should be fragmented and separated and put into different national care bodies, or whether they should stay with education in a local authority. So lots to think about connections going forward. We need to be brave on that too, as well as what we do in education.
Yeah, that's another word that's come up a few times around being brave. Gemma, can I ask you, how does it feel, that idea of being brave, and how might we embrace being brave, do you think?
I think being brave could mean using the disruption caused by COVID to try and push for change, as people have said, a chance to reflect on the system. Does it need to be this way, or is there a better way ahead? Are there things we can learn from the way that other countries do things? I think bureaucracy is still quite a big thing in the teaching profession, and if people are overwhelmed with that, it doesn't leave you a lot of room for anything else. And again, that's still something that seems to vary from school to school. It really just depends on where you work. So I think there's an opportunity to look at things at school level and also at national level.
Mm-hmm. Stephen, are you brave in your school? Is your school brave?
Well, it depends on the context, Sarah, I have to say. In terms of, I've just been reading the Stobart report, and they're talking about history and culture has the biggest influence on our exam system. But I also think history and culture is probably has the biggest influence on our leadership styles and our scrutiny. So on the theme of bravery, the whole system needs to be brave and ignore things like the Daily Mail and other newspapers, and actually not cave in to that voice, which is on the very periphery of Scottish culture. And that does take real political bravery, and I hope we get to that point. Can I go back about connection? I think in terms of connection, in terms of engaging people in the process and being invitational, I think we all need to work on our interpersonal skills and actually show our colleagues unconditional positive regard, work with authenticity and congruence, so that people are part of the process and feel part of the process. Because often that's missing. You know, I've worked in schools where it's a wee bit like Malcolm Tucker. You've got an option, and the option is how you're going to say yes, because you are forced into positions. And I think that if we are going to move to this new brave place where people are connected and have agency, we have to work on the interpersonal stuff that will take us there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that point around the conversations that need to happen and the level of engagement is something that came up yesterday as well, that there's an appetite for that engagement. It's how we enable that engagement to take place. Mark, you had your hand up.
Yes, I did. Yeah, I want to make a plea for two things to happen in a practical sense, I suppose. One is an emphasis on structure, but I mean a very particular type of structure. What I'm talking about here is attention to the ways in which people are positioned in relation to one another and the roles which they fill. So that would have, for example, implications for how, say, the RICs are operating, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And the second one is to do with process, and Graham mentioned earlier on professional inquiry. We know that processes which are highly structured, like professional inquiry, do provide people with a vision. They provide people with the networks, they work together. They provide people with the resources in terms of ideas, particularly interrupting the way that people think about their practice and disrupting the sort of tradition that Stephen talked about. Mm-hmm. So they're really important, I think. But one of the things that came out of our European case studies in the book that Carrie held up earlier on was the importance of what we call the meso layer of curriculum making. So in other words, this is the type of activity and the types of structures that sit between schools and policy, which mediate that relationship between schools and policy. And this is about providing leadership. It's about providing support and guidance. It's about producing resources which can be used commonly across schools to prevent schools from having to reinvent the wheel, and that saves a lot of time. But it's importantly also something that connects schools with policy. And I mean, I'm going to use the example of the Welsh Pioneer schools here. These networks haven't been perfect. They've been controversial in some respects. But one of the things that they do is they've embedded the work of the regional consortia in Wales, like the RICS, into schools by having people who are part-time in school and part-time in the regional consortium. So these are teachers who have been involved across Wales in teaching in their own schools, supporting colleagues in cluster work across other schools, and that means dissemination of ideas, for example, across fertilisation. They've also been involved in writing new curriculum specifications at a national level. So I think that this is the importance here of how we think about creating these social structures. And I'm not talking about organizations here, I'm talking about networks and the sort of processes that enable them to come together. I think that's really important for agency.
The importance of networks. Gail.
Just building on Mark's point, I totally agree. And in previous systems that I've worked very strongly on what was then called kind of leading teacher models. Exactly, you know, that role, Mark, that you were talking about in terms of creating the connection between classroom practitioner, policy and strategy development, and then the professional learning that links with it as well. So creating that kind of triangle of support, and absolutely using both formal and informal practitioner inquiry at the heart of that to then lead and work with peer support alongside schools and individuals. It's really central. There has been announcements and moves towards actually setting that on track in Scotland. And we see that as absolutely critical to the future of this debate and this discussion, because it must Pak Ti-young, who's part of the International Council of Education Advisors, Hong Kong, talks about centralization and decentralization and the space and the bit in between and how you move between and across them. And actually, I think we've got a real opportunity now to use the journey we've been on so far with empowerment, even though it's stalled a little bit with COVID and all these different things, actually to then use that as the connector. So we've got, you know, plans talking about leading teachers that would work very locally in ASGs and school clusters, you know, in a local authority, regionally, and you know, work with regional teams and RITs and everything, and also nationally. And that almost becomes a ladder to connect the different layers, the many layered system, and would really drive a greater and faster permeation of empowerment across the system. So I think there's an opportunity to be hopeful for that. And as I think it was Carrie said earlier, you know, it's a good time to be thinking and reflecting on this. And there's a great opportunity to build back better. I hate to use that phrase, but to build back better. It's late at night, I've forgotten the build back better. And I think it draws together Mark's kind of, it puts into an application and delivery into, you know, the concepts that we've been talking about. Yeah,
and I think you're absolutely right. There is every reason for us to be hopeful at the moment, and I think there's a real energy around that as well. I want to move us on just a little bit. We've talked about adults so far, and I want to bring in children and young people, particularly around this concept of agency. And I want to pull on the work of David Price in his book, The Power of Us. And it was a question I asked yesterday, and it's a question I'm going to ask tomorrow as well. But in his book, he asks us the question, you know, how do we help young people to become, and his phrase is, fearless agents of their own destinies. So I'd love us just to, I mean, we've not got long to unpick that one, but I think it's important that we recognise that when we're talking about agency, we are also talking about our children and young people as well. So who wants to start with that one?
Can I just make two quick, well, see Stephen gets hand up, just two quick points, Sarah. Yeah. One, just to finish the last discussion in terms of you know, the leading teacher model. So we have actually now got an agreement on a new job title, lead teacher, which can operate at school level, can operate at local authority level, can operate across schools. What we don't have is any money to create the post. Graham, take a note. So you know, there is an opportunity there, and it is about creating something that's not about hierarchical leadership, but about curriculum leadership. So I think there is an opportunity there. And just on the specific point that you raised, I was quite intrigued by the phrase you just used, and the first question that came into my head was, who's to say that they're not at the moment, because there's an assumption in there that, you know, that students have no say, and I think we've seen around the qualifications over the last couple of years, the students are not slow to articulate how they feel about what's happening to them, and articulate it very effectively. And I think genuinely one of the big gains from the whole curriculum for exercise has been that the voice of the learner has been much more prevalent than ever it was before. When I started teaching in 1979, you know, we were measured as being successful if your class was quiet and getting on with the work. And there's lots of head teachers now who are going like that. There's not a lot of dialogue in this class. You know, so I think we have enabled student voice in terms of their own learning much more than possibly we recognise. I mean, majority of the teaching profession in Scotland are under 40 now, so they maybe don't remember, or they won't remember, you know, what it was like not that very long ago in terms of practice. So I think we've actually made more steps forward than we sometimes give ourselves credit for. But I think there is then a point, and in terms of, you know, the rights of the child, this is an opportune point to think about, well, how do we actually enlarge that student voice? And that is about, in terms of empowerment, that is about the classroom teacher empowering the students in front of them and engaging in that way.
Thank you, Larry. I'm going to go Gemma, Stephen, and then Graham. So
I agree with Larry's point about young people protesting about their exam results. I think that was a great example of young people not being afraid to speak truth to power. And I feel that as a teacher, you've got I mean, it's in the standards as well, but I think you've got an obligation to understand social injustice and the things that affects our young people. And I think even just supporting the young people, being on their side, supporting their activism. I mean, I know that there are certain rules that different authority have, you know, a certain position on things like the climate protests that the young people are doing, but I think we have to understand why that is so essential and so important to young people who are going to have to live with the consequences of that. And I think it's important to allow the young people to protest, to express themselves on the things that matter to them.
Thanks, Gemma. Stephen.
Yeah, I think there is a growing sense of activism within our young people, and our young people are simply not going to put up with a whole load of stuff that their peers might have in years gone by. Things like sort of a curriculum that's not representative of a range of races, and not going to put up with things like homophobia and transphobia that's built into your system, or misogyny and things like that. They're not going to put up with a lack of focus on sustainability and climate. And we as schools need to be ready to accept that and engage with that, and actually give young people a platform where their voice can make a real difference, and it's not just tokenistic. In terms of the word that struck me when you posed the question was fearless. And I think across the country, we're obsessed with performance. And I think that performance obsession, I think, has got into the psyche of our young people. And we have lots of young people who are just really, really anxious. And I think we need to do a lot of work on our young people accepting themselves as really, really valuable human beings before we go anywhere around attainment and all that sort of thing. Because the fearless bit, I think, is the climate change thing builds into that, but also it's this whole focus on performance and comparative judgment that's all over social media. I don't want to sound like crusty blaming social media, because I'm on social media, but we need to work on young people accepting themselves for who they are.
Thank you. Graham.
Thanks, Sarah, and it's a great expression, you know, fearless agents of their own destiny. So thanks for sharing that with us. I mean, I agree that we've seen massive progress in this area. If you think of PISA and the global competency assessment, you know, the international evidence that gave of the skills and the capacities that our young people have, we can be really proud of that as a country. So I think we've seen a lot of improvement in the learner voice. Obviously, adopting UNCRC as a country, there's a lot of good work going on to implement that. And I think it happens at all levels as well. I mean, a phrase I used to love in the early days of implementing curriculum for excellence was really enabling children to become architects of their own learning. If we think of all the work around active learning and involving young people in making choices about how they demonstrate their learning. So I think it's a real success story for us. We certainly at national level have got young people on all the main groups, Education Recovery Group being an example where they contribute confidently and really constructively and with real impact. I think we've just got to watch that there's always enough support around involving young people in decision making so that it's not tokenistic. And certainly we've been working with groups like Young Scot and others to make sure there's the right scaffolding and support for young people to express their views and to make informed choices and decisions.
Yeah, thank you, Graham. And Mark.
Yeah, I'd like to comment briefly, possibly controversially, on the phrase fearless agents of their own destiny. I mean, one way of looking at that is it's a very neoliberal conception, which is individualistic. It's about saying that people who are fearless agents of their own destiny are therefore responsible if it doesn't go right, and perhaps misses out the sort of community and support stuff. Now, I do take into account what people have been saying about providing the scaffolding, for example. But I think it's important just to acknowledge that, because there is a lot of critique around sort of notions of empowerment in exactly those terms. I want to also share an anecdote. We ran, or one of my colleagues ran this week, a word cloud with a cohort of 400 plus first year student teachers. Well, they weren't all student teachers, they're people on an education studies course, so about half of them are student teachers. And they were asked to write down the three things that they thought were the highest priority in their secondary school. So most of these are people who have just left secondary school. And the three words that were most prominent in the word cloud were attendance, exams, and uniform. And it makes you wonder then where education is in this. So I'd like to make a plea really that we think very carefully about two things. One, about the hidden messages, the hidden curriculum that we convey through our system, and the messages we're sending to our young people. But also, I think at a deeper level, we need to think about how we do genuinely develop the agency of young people. And we do that by creating authentic educational experiences for them, where they're engaged in activities right the way through from a young age as citizens becoming, not citizens in waiting, citizens who are becoming and who are practicing citizenship in genuine, authentic situations, and developing the knowledge and skills required to be active, critical, and of course responsible citizens when they become able to vote and when they become adults. So those are just a few points.
Carrie, we're just about getting out of time, so I'll let you in there, Carrie.
2 seconds, just to say that Curriculum for Excellence gives us the opportunity to do exactly that if we implement it effectively. What we need to sort are the national qualifications.
Well, you were quick. And I think you're right. There's that connection where we started between the conversations yesterday around curriculum, today around empowerment and agency, and tomorrow around leadership. And I think there's a real dynamic relationship across all of those, and we're seeing similar themes kind of coming up and bubbling around there. There is just 2 minutes left, so it is my job probably just to round things off at this point. Otherwise, we could end up speaking all night, and I'm aware that we do have the International Council coming on afterwards at 7 o'clock as well. So we recognise it's been tea time here in Scotland, so people are probably juggling a number of things as they're here listening and engaging. So thank you to my colleagues for your energy, your participation, your honesty and your contributions tonight. And thank you also to those who have joined us from home or work or wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining, and thank you for sharing your comments in the chat as well. I wish everybody a lovely evening. Thank you so much. You can wave, it's obligatory. Thank you.